We just heard a lovely song, Lord Jesus, I long to be perfectly whole. In John chapter 5, it says, a certain man was there which had an infirmity 38 years. When Jesus saw him lie and knew that he had been a long time in that case, he saith unto him, wilt thou be made whole? That goes right with the song, doesn't it? The impotent man answered him, Sir, I have no man when the water is troubled to put me into the pool, but while I am coming, another steppeth down before me. Today it's not uncommon for other people to crowd ahead of the poorest, most needy people for the healthcare system. They crowd in because they have a bigger insurance card. They crowd in because they have an emergency. This was 38 years sick. It was not one that would get first place in the triage of an emergency. He wasn't drowning. He hadn't had a heart attack. He had just been laying there for a long time. So Jesus saith unto him, Rise, take up thy bed and walk. And immediately the man was made whole. You know your Bibles. And took up his bed and walked. And the same day was the Sabbath. So it was on Sabbath Jesus performed this miracle. Christ often healed the sin-sick part of a person at the same time that he healed the physical part of a person. And that's the only way you can be made whole. You can't be made whole just by getting an artificial hip if you have a hardened heart or a head that's not on straight. So we want to be made whole. That's what the motto of the school I went to in Southern California, Loma Linda, was called To Make Man Whole. It was a really good motto because that was the footsteps of Jesus, the pattern that he sent for us. Now, in order to make the remnant people whole so that they have the health and the vigor and the energy to give the final warning message, which is called the loud cry. It's not just because you shout louder, it's because you have energy and maybe the spirit to go with your words. Have you ever given somebody a piece of their mind and they didn't like you afterwards? The loud cry is going to bring converts to the gospel. It's going to bring penitent hearts. It's going to bring changed lives. And so it has to be given in the right way, at the right time, and God has given us a method of doing that by combining the health message with the gospel. Because most everyone is interested in health. Not all realize their need of spiritual healing. But when it's combined together, it wins people to the message. It'll win people to this congregation right here. It'll win people to change their whole focus of life from earning more and spending more to giving more and serving better. And that's what I want to see and experience as well. So what I'm going to share with you today is a few health principles that you already know about and where they came from. Because God in His mercy gave them to His people, His people that look for His second coming, His people that lift up His law, His people that like to obey what He says. And God in His mercy gave it to us through a messenger who was about the feeblest instrument you could possibly look for. If you wanted to give a message on health to somebody, you'd want somebody like maybe Jack LaLanne or somebody who was Mr. Universe or some beauty queen to be charismatic enough to give a final message on health and healing. But instead, God looked around and he found one that wasn't too interested, another that was afraid he might be rejected, and finally found a woman who was hurt so badly at age 9 that she couldn't breathe through her nose and hovered on the point of death for weeks and weeks. And her name was Ellen Harmon. I lived in Maine for about 20 years and often took people on tours through some of these places. And when Ellen, as a schoolgirl in the 3rd grade, was hit by a rock that knocked her unconscious, a naughty older schoolmate threw the rock, knocked her out. She was laid at home in her bed and her face swelled up so bad that her father didn't even recognize her when he came back from a trip. And couldn't believe it was his daughter. And she was never able to go back to formal education again. She tried once or twice, but could not, because of headaches and concentration and all, study again. And it was this girl that hit her with the rock who was assigned to tutor her for part of the time, because she felt so bad about what she'd done. And so from that background of lack of formal education came a person who became the most prolific woman author in the history of America, especially in the nonfiction category, and whose books have been translated into more languages in the world than any other author except for the Bible. And here in the collection of these writings are some things about health that were given at a time when health knowledge was dismally deficient in this country and in the world. At the time that those writings were given, the average physician had maybe 2 years of formal education and a certificate given. They had no knowledge of physiology, and like we have today, surgery was non-existent because there was no safe anesthesia, and people had no way to combat infection. And so the doctors of that day would recommend something like smoking a pipe for lung disease. Now, do you know anybody that would recommend taking up pipe smoking for emphysema? Or asthma? Or bronchitis? No. There's people that are smoking all kinds of things these days, and it's affecting them adversely. There's almost universal agreement about that. And so that was the state of things 150 years ago. Now I want to just share a tiny group of evidences that tie in the knowledge that was given to God's people and the state of things of health. First of all, going from the book of John to Jeremiah, in chapter 33 is a promise. Jeremiah 33 verse 6, "Behold, I will bring it health and cure, and I will cure them, and will reveal unto them the abundance of peace and truth." So the purpose of the health message is to bring healing. And in 3 John verse 2 it says, "Beloved, I wish above all things that thou mayest prosper and be in what? Health, even as thy soul prospers." That means as we're spiritually healthy, so we can be physically healthy, and by having that degree of energy bring prosperity. Now, the health and cure, and it says, "I will cure them," and reveal something. The abundance of peace and truth. So that's God's plan for His people. Now I want to look at some health statistics and some health information this afternoon. First of all, if you look at deaths around the world, you will see that the leading cause of death, even in worldwide countries is cardiovascular, heart and blood vessel diseases, mostly heart attacks and strokes. It is affecting people in India, in China, as their prosperity level increases, and it's usually the ones who are very well fed and well taken care of that suffer these diseases more than the ones that are starving. The ones that are poor and feeble are the ones that get the communicable diseases or contagious infectious diseases, and perinatal means the infant mortality, the ones that die in childbirth, which is very great around the world. Now, cancer is the next leading cause in America, and it is seen in other countries of the world as well, including Africa and India and China and so forth. Respiratory diseases includes pneumonia and emphysema. Diabetes is down here, injuries. But do you know what is leading more and more in America as a cause of death? Here are some preventable causes. The leading cause of death that's preventable is tobacco smoking. Now, cigarette smoking has dropped from 60% down to 44%, down to 23% in this country with a tremendous educational effort against tobacco. When I was a medical student, I first conducted a 5-day stop smoking plan. And I had asked my professor, who was not a Seventh-day Adventist, that was at March Air Force Base, if I could take a week off from my assignment under his care. He was a cardiologist. I said, I'd like to go give a stop smoking plan in the city of Winnemucca, Nevada. Way up in the middle of the state. Now, if I had asked the professor at Loma Linda, could I take a week off to go to Winnemucca and conduct a stop smoking program, I think I would have been denied. But this man, being an Air Force officer, he said, there's nothing you can learn to do that will help people more than to teach them to quit smoking. So he excused me for a week, and I studied thoroughly this interaction of smoking and ill health and how to help people quit, and have been doing that all ever since. But number 2 behind this is what? Overweight and obesity. That has become an epidemic in this country. As smoking rates are decreasing, the waistline is increasing. And so we see that as the second leading cause of preventable death. Isn't that interesting? And we'll come back to that in a moment. Alcohol comes in number 3. Infections that are preventable would be number 4. Toxins, major vehicle accidents, collisions, firearms death, STDs, drug abuse, and we haven't listed on here the emotional part that leads to suicide, which is also preventable in many cases. If people found Jesus in time, they would never want to take their life. Amen. So this is an interesting chart. Now there's a relationship, as you know, between smoking and cancer. This is what children think of it. There's harmful chemicals. There's about 72 very harmful chemicals in tobacco smoke. And just that little thing that comes out of a cigarette and goes into people's lungs. It's the leading cause, as I mentioned, harms nearly every organ and system in the body, causes many kinds of cancer. We had somebody come to us with a little coughing up of blood. I said, you know, that's not good. He said, well, it's gone now. I don't cough anymore. But just that one episode of coughing up blood prompted me to send him for a chest x-ray. He had a big tumor in his lung. This man was not only a smoker of cigarettes, a smoker of marijuana, he was the owner of a business cleaning chimneys.
Oh, that's
And you know the creosote in the chimney is equally carcinogenic. So he had spent plenty of time up in the chimneys running the brush up and down and cleaning them. If you ever do that to your home, and I hope you will before you catch it on fire, wear a mask, take a shower, clean your clothes so that the chemicals in the smoke do not hurt you. So we sent him into a surgeon, and he wanted to run tests and more tests and more tests. I said, you know, you can run tests till this cancer spreads all through his body. I think you should operate and take it out. So we finally found the right surgeon, and he had surgery, and they opened his chest and put that lobe of the lung into a little plastic bag and then pulled the plastic bag out after they'd cut all the circulation. Did a marvelous job, and I think it's going to save his life. Or at least it can, because he has quit smoking. But he thinks he still needs marijuana. And I said to him, and he thinks he needs bacon in the morning too. And I said, if you want to avoid the undertaker, you better change your diet and quit all that pollution going into your body. Amen. And he looked at me sort of with a deer in the headlights look and said, you know, we've got to make little changes at a time. Well, I say, if you've got a disease that bad, you better change everything. Amen. Yeah. And so we are getting more bold, and especially my good wife. She'll just tell him what to eat and what not to eat, and I'll tell you how that works in a moment. But we have an addictive substance here, and it's hard to quit. And we should recognize that our neighbors and friends that are smoking have a monkey on their back, as we say. It's not easy to quit. It's easier to quit alcohol than it is tobacco. But there are no people better equipped to help people quit smoking than Seventh-day Adventists. Because if you know Jesus, you know where the help comes from. Amen. And it says, my help cometh from the Lord. And so we learned years ago that you get better results helping people quit smoking when you introduce the gospel and you pray for people than just behavioral modification. And so try to do that. And of course there are dangers in secondhand smoke. That means the smoke, the side stream that fills a room. Not too many rooms nowadays get filled with smoke like they used to, but if you're going to plead with a smoker to quit, try to do it outside so you don't have to breathe as much, avoid as much pollution as possible. I walked out of a car dealership one day. We were renting a van for our health sessions, and right outside the door in this little alcove there were two men smoking a cigarette right outside the door. And I walked out the door, and as I walked through I said, man, it's smoky out here. Now usually I would just take a deep breath and shut my mouth and take faster steps and go by, but it just popped out. One man said, oh, I'm sorry, sir, I didn't mean to offend you. I said, you know, that didn't offend me in the slightest. I was concerned about you. You're hurting yourself. To which he replied, thank you for reminding me. I know I need to quit. So if we do in the right spirit, at the right time, you can help people, and sometimes that's all they need to jog them into what they know they really ought to be doing. Now, the point of my sharing that, which is familiar to you, is to show you what the servant of the Lord wrote years ago. Tobacco is a slow, insidious, but most malignant poison. What does malignant mean? It means it can cause death or cancer. And so we use the term malignant for a lesion that turns into that is cancerous. In whatever form it is used. That means chewing tobacco, that means smoking tobacco, that means some other forms, these hookahs and smokeless and all of those that are harmful forms. It tells upon the Constitution. It is all the more dangerous because its effects are slow and at first hardly perceptible. And isn't that true? Yes. Some of you have probably been smokers in the past, and you know the first time you tried it, it made you sick. But then you got used to it, and it didn't seem like it was bothering you at all, maybe a little cough, but no serious harm. One man told me, he said, I've already had cancer in one lung, I'm immune. And he continued to smoke. I warned him. I pled with him. And he eventually got cancer in the other lung too, and it took his life. So here's the physiology. It excites and then paralyzes the nerves. It weakens and clouds the brain. Often it affects the nerves in a more powerful manner than it does intoxicating drink. It is more subtle and its effects are difficult to eradicate from the system. So here's the third grade education that gave physiology beyond the medical profession until the 1950s. And in 1952, Drs. Hammond and Horn published a study that showed the effects of tobacco on the lungs. And to experiment with it, they used beagle dogs. And they did a tracheotomy on the dogs and hooked them up to a smoking machine. And those dogs, the first time they were taken in there, held their breath, and some of them passed out. They just quit breathing because they knew something poisonous was going in. In just a few days, when it was time for them to go into this smoking laboratory, they were wagging their tails, showing the addictive effects. And they won a Nobel Prize for showing the relation between tobacco smoking and lung cancer. And then Dr. Arbach came along a few years later and showed that when they quit smoking, the tars would gradually begin cleaning out of the lungs until about in 9 months, for the average pack-a-day smoker, they would have clean lungs again. Isn't the Lord merciful to help our bodies just to recover? And so I think that's really good news. But the other thing that Ellen White pointed out was its use, that is tobacco's use, excites a thirst for strong drink and makes a person more likely to become an alcoholic, and an alcoholic more likely to keep smoking. So these are synergistic and feed on each other, these unhealthful habits. Now, take another case in point. I'm quickly moving from point to point this afternoon. Meat eating. And by that I'm talking about animal products, beef, pork, chicken, and so forth. There's an increased risk of cancer in the lower part of the intestinal tract, and increased risk of heart disease and diabetes, and the effect on body weight, and I'm going to show you some charts on this in just a moment, carries the highest risk of foodborne illness. Infectious diseases are carried through animal products far more than, say, vegetables or fruits. Because when they're spoiled, you know it. You can do what's called the smell test on vegetables and fruits. But people take things that are decayed in the animal products and they just think they can cook it. Or that it's already dead so it won't hurt them. And it can make a person resistant to antibiotics because they put antibiotics in the feed for most of the farm-grown animals. And that's to keep them from getting infectious diseases themselves. So those antibiotics go into the milk, they go into the meat, and into the people that consume them. And the hormones, both testosterone and estrogens, are in animal products these days. Chicken, not so much fish, because they get away from the toxins, except that the rivers and lakes, and even to some degree the oceans, get pollution. You probably know that there's a section miles in diameter in the Pacific Ocean that's absolutely dead. That it cannot support the life of fish or any other creature because of the pollution from the cities that's been dumped into the ocean as a giant cesspool that we think has unlimited capacity to accumulate our waste. But it is not so. And those who have been out to sea have probably seen this. Now, what inspired writings did we see on this subject? Those who subsist largely upon meat cannot avoid sometimes eating flesh which is more or less diseased. Today there's new laws being passed that allow people to take an animal that they've hit with their car or truck and just take them home for food, called roadkill. But some of those animals have suffered greatly. Do you think their hormones change if they've suffered for a long time before they finally die? And so they eat those animals and then are subject to whatever problem the animal had. In many cases, the process of fitting animals for market produces an unhealthy condition. This would be the holding pens where large truckloads of cattle are taken and held for 30 days and fed and fed and fed to fatten them up for market, so the meat has more tenderness and becomes marbled with the fat cholesterol in the muscle parts, and so we see more contamination. Shut away from light and pure air, inhaling the atmosphere of healthy stables, or we could say holding pens today, the entire body soon becomes contaminated with foul matter, and when such flesh is received into the human body, it corrupts the blood and disease is produced, including inflammation that Kay was talking about this morning. We have an expression, you are what you eat. Do you believe that?
Yes.
Do you believe that it can affect your circulation, your nervous system, your brain, your disposition? I remember having a cat one time, and every time it chased down and ate a squirrel or a bird, its disposition would change for hours. It would scratch, it would snarl, you couldn't hold it, and then by the next day it was one of these that rubs along your leg and purrs when you come by and would sit in your arms and nuzzle you a little bit. But its disposition was dramatically changed with when it was on the hunt. Now, how strong is the evidence for this? The evidence is very strong that red meats are related to cancer risk. They fall into group 2A, which probably causes cancer. And that includes the beef and the lamb, and the pork particularly is a cause of inflammation. Why do you suppose a pig would bring more inflammation products? Because of the diet that it eats. What does a pig eat different than a cow? They are called scavengers. They eat, the most refined word for it is swill. And they will eat anything. But a cow is more fastidious, will only eat grass and plant products. You understand that, I'm sure. Some of you have been farmers. We had a guest who was a Texas cattle rancher. And I'm giving a lecture on this subject to the group, and he's sitting there thinking of his life dream of owning a ranch. And so I talked to him some about the mad cow disease and some of the causes. And he put his hand up and he said, Dr. Hansen, I had an interesting experience one time. I went down to the feed store and I got this high protein supplement for my animals. Had pictures of the shiny skin and how the health of the animal. Advertising is always a little bit deceptive. So he bought the bags of this material, and it just said protein supplement, and he sprinkled it on the hay and the silage that he had put out for his cattle that night. And they all came in at the usual time for supper and walked up and sniffed, and none of them would eat it. Not a single four-legged animal would eat that food that night. And he thought, whoa. And then he started reading the fine print, ingredients, and realized that it was animal products that were being fed back to the cattle from the rendered animals, and that those cows had more sense than he did. Needless to say, he threw it away and didn't ever offer it to his cattle again. But he confirmed what we were trying to teach. And then we come to the processed meats. And of all the different animal foods, do you know what America's favorite is?
Hot dogs.
Hot dogs. They sell more on the 4th of July than any other food, even more than ice cream cones. So these foods that have not only nitrites, but are often broiled or braised on a outdoor barbecue, the polycyclic hydrocarbons are all carcinogenic and cause the gastrointestinal cancers and increase the risk of many others. So this is information from the Cancer Research Institute, not from Ellen White et al., but it confirms what she said years ago. Now, if you look at weight, we saw that as the number 2 preventable causes of death. If you take, and I'll read the prints for you because they're finer, non-vegetarian, semi-vegetarian, I'm not sure what that is actually, but you can guess that might be a person that's mostly vegetarian until they go to their relatives on Thanksgiving or some other time. Pesco-vegetarian, what does that mean?
Only fish.
Only fish, yeah. It takes a sea captain to define. Lacto-ovo-vegetarian means milk and eggs, and vegan is a term used for the total vegetarian. Now, the same chart with the same colors is over here. Here we have the body mass index. That's your size in relation to your height. Weight divided by your meters squared, which is your surface area of your body. So the higher weights of people parallel exactly the progression of diet. A person that's vegan is, on the average, thinner than those who are overweight and eat meat. Dr. Mervyn Harding, who is a professor of nutrition, said the only disadvantage of being lean is when you get old, you might become lonely because your other friends have passed away sooner. That was his comment. And he lived to be 99 years old, died over in Brewster, not far from here, lived with his relatives, and I often saw him at church on Sabbath because I have relatives in that town too, including my uncle who was a doctor in Brewster and died at age 99 also, just a short time before Dr. Harding did. My uncle was the only physician in Okanagan County during part of World War II, and they gave him an unlimited ration card for gasoline because he went from town to town holding clinic in different towns and always carried plasma with him in his car because he, as a first responder, saved the life of many an accident victim, including at his funeral was a retired policeman whose life he had saved when that man was just a young fellow. A very interesting family history since I grew up in Washington here. Oh, back on the second part of the chart. Type 2 diabetes similarly parallels the diets of people. So you can see it's directly related to diet and also to weight. Now, here's a very famous person, probably not your favorite president, but he is a vegan. Did you know that? After having stents and heart attacks, finally he was persuaded by his daughter, and he said, I just decided I was the high-risk person. I think he really was. And I didn't want to fool with this anymore, and I wanted to live to be a grandfather. So I decided to pick the diet that I thought would maximize my chances of long-term survival. Well, I say better late than never. But I'm glad that he's at least going around publicly proclaiming something worthwhile. Now, I want to share with you an experience that we had in our clinic in Creswell with a man in his 50s who came to us wanting a checkup. He is a pilot. He wanted to be sure he could pass his flight physical. He wasn't so sure he was going to, and he wanted a checkup in advance. A businessman who had a teenage son, and he said, I want to check up. And when we did blood tests, his cholesterol was 250, his HDL very, very low, triglycerides over 1100, which is about 10 times normal and safe, blood sugar 318. He had discovered he had diabetes. His A1C, which is an average of blood sugar over 3 months, 11.3. Normal is about 5 to 5.4%. And he was low on testosterone even. And so here's a businessman, an executive actually, with a large engine company, diesel engine company, and traveled much but got little exercise. It's possible to travel widely but sit on airplanes all the time and sit in airports and not get much activity. Had a lot of stress both at work and home. And here he had all these risk factors. He was a heart attack waiting to happen. He said, Kay called him on the phone to give him the results of his physical. He said, well, before I get in next week to talk with the doctor, what do you think I should do? And we found out when we interviewed him that he drank a gallon of milk a day, which is probably more than most of you drink in a month. So he liked milk, as you can see. Even though he was 55, he was not weaned. Well, Kay thought, what should I tell him? Usually we say, well, you know, do a little less of this and a little more of that, eat more fruit and less meat, and start making gradual changes. You know how gentle we try to be with people. She said, I think you ought to give up all meat, all milk, and go total vegetarian, just eat fruit and vegetables and whole grain cereals, and then go out and walk 5 miles a day. And you know what he said? He said, he didn't say, I can't do that. He said, I'm on board. That's a good nautical term, isn't it, brother? I'm on board. He got on board, and he did it just like that. He said, I'm going to eat the vegan way. And he started walking 5 miles a day, and if his travels took him, so he got at least 2 miles in. And we checked him again, and his blood sugars were coming down, 127, which is just slightly above normal. His A1C started getting better in just 2 months. In 4 months, his cholesterol was down to normal range. His HDL had almost doubled. His triglycerides had dropped from 1100 to 127. His A1C is just very slightly above normal. so that he's in borderline diabetes state instead of uncontrolled diabetes. And this is without a single drug. He said if I had gone to any other doctor, he would have written me a statin prescription for the cholesterol, a blood pressure lowering medication, 1 or 2 diabetes pills at the very minimum. In fact, some of his friends were angry that he had such a poor doctor that wouldn't give him the drugs for the disease. But do you know why we did this? Is because he said, I want to do it naturally, if at all possible. Those are the kind of people that make me extremely happy and feel rewarded for what I learned years ago at Loma Linda. And working with Weimar in their reversing diabetes sessions. And so we have here we call him our poster child, you know, exhibit A of what can be done, which is rarely accomplished, not because we don't want to see it, but because people won't do it all. In other words, you get out of it what you put into it. And so he was willing, and still is willing, to make these drastic changes. And what he also noticed is that his fatigue level was gone. His mind, he was calmer. His joint pains went away. He was no longer constipated. His blood pressure came down to normal. He even had a tongue that looked like a map. We call it geographic tongue. And it was kind of a strange looking tongue, and it completely turned normal. And aches and pains in his muscles all went away. Fringe benefits. God says, I will bring it health and cure. Now, in order to maintain it, what has he got to do? Follow through and continue with that lifestyle. And that's what he has told us he intends to do. Now, we're also promised that when people see that we have common sense in regard to health, they will think that we can't be far off on religious things. But where did we get all these ideas from? We didn't get them all from medical science. We got them from God, from the spirit of prophecy years ago. So whether it's the hormones in these meats, you can see that the death risk goes up in many of these countries, even Japan and Sweden, USA, with more meat consumption. And what has happened in the last 40, 50 years? There's been a steady increase in meat consumption, and even a higher increase in cheese consumption. We went to an airport we were traveling through, and we looked at something we could get to eat. On the West Coast, it's not hard. There's always stir fries, and there's bean burritos and different things that are healthy. In the East, not so much. So we saw a pizza. We thought we could get them to leave the cheese off, but then found out that the cheese was in the crust. And actually the leading pizza manufacturer in America was coached by the government to put more cheese in it if they wanted to sell more pizzas. So they put 3 in the crust and 5 on top. And they are now the leaders, which shows that our American people have a strong taste for cheese. Now, what did Ellen White say about it? She says it was unfit for food. Now, isn't that interesting? When the USDA says that it's one of the most important foods if you want to sell your product, and the SDA says it's unfit for food. So, what are we going to do? I went to Germany and noticed that the Ministry of Healing, this marvelous book of wisdom from God's servant, had been translated into German, and the one sentence they left out in their German translation was that sentence, cheese is unfit for food. I turned to the page and I showed them to my friends, and I said, what happened here? Why did they leave out such an important thing? And my German friends smiled And they says, well, we like cheese. Well, if you go to some of the bigger churches and you go to the potluck dinners, you'll find it there too. Because we are, as a people, struggling against something that the ancient Israelites had called rebellion against God's revealed will. Like the ones that didn't like manna any longer because they called it, we loathe this simple food. Kay showed you the slide this morning. Now, here is an inspired letter from Ellen White that's in a pamphlet. We cannot now do as we have ventured to do in the past in regard to meat eating. It has always been a curse to the human family, but now it is made particularly so in the curse which God has pronounced upon the herds of the field because of man's transgression and sins. The disease upon animals is becoming more and more common, and our only safety now is leaving meat entirely alone. You see, what was given originally to Noah and his descendants after the flood was the permission to eat animal foods. The clean ones only, but they were to eat that food higher in protein. And why did God intend to give them those foods? It shortened their lives. Before the flood, they lived 600, 800, 900 years. An unbelievable lifespan of health and vigor. Noah built the ark when he was 600 years old. It's hard to find a 60-year-old person who can build a house today. But he built the ark when he was 600, with the help of his boys, of course, and many others. But then, over the years, the lifespan went down, down, down until Abraham, who lived to be what? 175. That's right, brother. 175. Moses lived 120 years. And then in the days of David, the king, the lifespan of man was 70, or if by reason of strength, 80. And today we see some people living to be 90 or even 100. And if you see a community where people have a higher percentage over 100, what do we call that? The blue zone. Yes, the blue zone. Geographic did an article on that, and in this country, where is the blue zone? It's Loma Linda, California. One of my heart surgery professors, Dr. Ellsworth Wareham, is now up probably 104 or 105. He retired when he was 96 years old. And they didn't want him to retire because he was still a vigorous, interesting teacher and lecturer, and would go down to the hospital and teach the residents how to do open heart surgery. They would do the initial part of the surgery. He'd get in there and do the finesse of the valve or whatever they were doing, and still could tie the knots, and his fingers were just as nimble as can be. And then he would show them and then let them finish it up. And the reason he retired wasn't because he was over the hill or going senile. He said, I just need more time with my wife and my children and my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren. He wanted more family time and more time in the garden and not to have to do so much driving and preparing for lectures. So he's one of those you can find on the internet if you want an interesting interview, and you'll find out that long before other people were talking about a total plant-based diet, he was eating it years ago, before many of his contemporaries. Now, sugar also affects health. Kay dealt with this morning, so I won't spend too much time on it, except that it does affect your immune system, can lead to nutrient deficiencies such as chromium, tooth decay, gum disease, affects learning in children. Did you know that a high sugar diet is a contributor to hyperactive attention deficit disorder in children today. Ask any teacher or babysitter. Sugar increases stress, accelerates aging, and so forth. But notice what we were told years ago, because this hour I'm trying to show you how the light that God gave us is being validated by modern science, and we're not dealing with somebody who copied the information of her time, which we call plagiarism. This was not anything she learned from a nutrition professor in a university, but she got it from God. Large quantities of milk and sugar, she says, eaten together are injurious. What is one of the leading foods that combines milk and sugar?
Ice cream.
You got it.
Ice cream.
Yeah, they impart impurities to the system. Animals from which milk is obtained are not always healthy. Could we know that animals were in perfect health, I would recommend that people eat flesh meats sooner than large quantities of milk and sugar. Isn't that interesting? It would not do the injury that milk and sugar do. So we say, I'm a lacto-vegetarian. I just eat milk and sugar along with my granola and whatnot. Especially harmful, she says, are the custards and puddings in which milk, eggs, and sugars are the chief ingredients. The free use of milk and sugar taken together should be avoided. If milk is used, it should be thoroughly what? Sterilized. How do you sterilize a liquid? You bring it to a boil. If you bring milk to a boil and then cool it down, you have sterilized milk. Is that what they sell in the milk bottle at the store? No. That's what you'd get in canned milk. That's been sterilized. But milk in the bottles is pasteurized, which means 15 seconds at 170 degrees temperature, called flash pasteurization, to kill the majority of bacteria that would cause disease. It's not sterilized, though. And so with this precaution, she says, there's less danger of contracting disease from its use. But according to this reference, if you take that sterilized milk even and combine it with large amounts of sugar, it would be better to eat meat. Don't go from here saying Dr. Hansen told us to go eat meat, because that's not the point of this at all, as you know. And then caffeine, which is one of the leading favored beverages. More than 4 cups of coffee linked to early death, like heart rhythm disturbance. Caffeine consumption may raise blood pressure. It certainly does, because when people come in for a truck driving examination or a flight physical and they've just had a latte, near always their blood pressure will be high. And they'll say, well, I'm just stressed because I'm having this physical. But we ask them to come in without their coffee, and they come in and their blood pressure is normal. We've seen it over and over. Increased risk of heart attacks among young adults. That means age 30s, 40s, under 50. Gout is related. Insomnia is common, can cause indigestion, headaches, anxiety, depression. In fact, there is a psychiatric disease called caffeinism, which is just from large amounts of caffeine, sometimes up to 20 cups a day. Women can get tissue cysts, fibrocystic changes in their breast. It can lead to incontinence. It doesn't help in prolonged sleep deprivation. It will not keep a person awake while they're driving a vehicle. It'll make them more likely to fall asleep instantly, which is very bad if you're driving a semi. And it increases the amount of sugary beverages consumed. It'll make a person want more of that. Now, what counsels were we given? This is from the Review and Herald in 1897. Coffee is a hurtful indulgence. It temporarily excites the mind to unwanted action, and the effect is prostration, sadness, exhaustion of the mental, moral, and physical forces. Now, isn't that significant? That what we're seeing today was predicted 100 years ago. Are you thankful for these writings?
Amen.
If you need a copy of Ministry of Healing or Counsels on Diet and Foods or Counsels on Health, get those books. You can go on the internet. You can probably find some in the library here. We have offered them in our church library to anybody that doesn't have one. I don't have a bunch of copies here, but I'd sure send one if you needed it. It affects the mind, and here is an interesting thing. Unless through determined effort the habit is overcome, the activity of the brain is greatly lessened. Now, how many here would like to have less brain activity? Anybody need less brain activity? Or could you use a little more?
Yes.
Maybe it would help those things we call senior moments. And then, finally, it becomes a warning element against spiritual progress. You see, if we are not practicing the principles of temperance, we can't grow spiritually like we need to. And that means not only temperance in eating and drinking, it means temperance in working, it means temperance in all things. Now, the advantages of this type of plant-based diet that we've been talking about mean you've reduced the risk of many diseases, as I've mentioned already, including osteoporosis. Weight control is easier, your teeth are improved, you've eliminated the risk of mad cow disease, less infection risk, you have antioxidants and phytochemicals that help your immune system, you're kinder to the animals, of course. If the turkeys were voting before Thanksgiving, they'd vote for vegan Thanksgiving, and the planet through many factors. Bottom line is longer life. Now, this will not help you live forever. It is the tree of life you need to help you live forever. But it is a help on the way to heaven. It's a help to have better health and less medical bills and more energy and less absenteeism from Sabbath school and church on Sabbath morning. I was impressed this morning with the number of people that were here on time for Sabbath school. I hope that's the case every week, and if it is, I just rejoice with you. We were having a problem getting people to come at 9:30 for Sabbath school. I offered even a free alarm clock to anybody who needed one. And then I found out that there's something better than that. Angels take record and count us absent if we don't come and share the blessings God has given us. If we don't speak up for God, we're not counted present. And so I hope you'll give your testimony of what God does for you. We're told that families and institutions should learn to do more in the cultivation and improvement of land. If people only knew the value of the products of the ground which the earth brings forth in their season, more diligent efforts would be made to cultivate the soil. All should be acquainted with the special value of fruit and vegetables fresh from the orchard and garden. Now, there may be some that, for reasons of occupation or where you live, can hardly grow a garden. I was speaking to a group in Manhattan one time, and they all live in high-rise apartment houses. And one person put up their hand and says, "Doc, I've got a garden. I've got this little balcony outside my apartment, and I've got tomatoes growing in a pot out there." And I said, "Good for you. You're doing some in this direction." But the more we can get out of the cities and out in the country, the more we can grow our own food. And doesn't God intend for us to do that? Yes. I was going to show you a picture of our garden this year, but I had it on a different platform than the computer. And we planted about 35 tomato plants, about 30-some pepper plants. Kay dug up 100 pounds of potatoes out of our garden. We've picked and canned and frozen beans. We've got peaches and apples and berries, several kinds of berries. We're picking strawberries in October. And since June, blueberries. The only competition we had was from robins getting in the blueberries. So we finally solved that problem. We put a big wire fence over all the blueberry plants. We have about 24. Because I learned that blueberries help the aging brain. And so we heard a lecture on that subject, came home and started growing blueberries. Well, the birds were getting in there. They like blueberries too for some reason. And they kept getting in through the fence. So a friend of mine says, well, you want me to get my 22 out and take care of them? I said, oh no, they sing too. We like their songs. Please don't do that. So he got the garden hose, and when they got in the blueberries, he sprayed them with water until they were so bedraggled they couldn't fly, and then he could pick them up and put them off in a place where they had to dry out and learn their lesson. So we're trying to teach our feathered friends discipline. And they can eat the worms if they want to. So God has said, of these ye may freely eat. And again and again, servant of the Lord says, I say it to God's people too, again and again. I have been shown that God is trying to lead us back to His, step by step, to His original design, that man should subsist upon the natural products of the earth. Among those who are waiting for the coming of the Lord, meat eating will eventually be done away. Flesh will cease to form a part of their diet. We should ever keep this end in view and endeavor to work steadily toward it. Would you like to help your friends and neighbors work toward that? It'll pay dividends. And again, we've been showing these things. And I say to you today, this is another one of those agains. But maybe I'm preaching to the choir. You all know these things. But your neighbors and friends don't know it. And if you know these things, happy are ye if ye do them. Even happy are you if you can teach somebody else to do them. Now we're going to take a little time to see if you have any